The Napier Deltic gave British Rail the power it desperately needed, but there was a price. Noise so loud that crews needed earplugs every shift, station announcements stopped working, and hearing damage became an everyday risk. This is the story of an engine that saved the railways while deafening everyone around it. The Napier Deltic engine arrived in the late 1940s with one clear purpose and no room for compromise. Naval torpedo boats needed extreme speed from the lightest engine possible. These boats lived short and violent lives at full throttle where speed meant survival. Noise didn't matter at all. Crews worked in open air and missions lasted minutes, not hours. Comfort was never part of the brief. The Deltic delivered exactly what the Navy asked for, and it did it without apology. From the start, the design was unlike anything else. The engine used 18 cylinders arranged in a triangle rather than a straight line or a V-shape. Each corner of the triangle held a crankshaft, and all three were linked by gears to a single output shaft. Inside each cylinder, two pistons moved toward each other in a two-stroke cycle. There were no cylinder heads and no valves. Combustion happened constantly with a firing event every 20 degrees of rotation. The result was smooth and relentless power with almost no pause between strokes. That layout created something else as well, the sound. Instead of a deep pulse, the Deltic produced a sharp, buzzing roar that stayed at a constant pitch. It was loud and harsh and impossible to ignore. In naval service, this wasn't a problem because a torpedo boat at full speed already drowned out everything else. The engine was judged only by speed and weight, and in both areas it excelled. A compact package delivered power levels that normally required much larger engines. That power density caught attention beyond the Navy. In 1955, English Electric, which owned Napier, saw a chance to bring this engine to the rails. A prototype locomotive was built using two marine engines with a combined output of 3,300 horsepower. For its time, this placed it among the most powerful diesel locomotives in the world. The prototype looked the part. It carried a bold front end inspired by American designs and tall body sides with clean cream striping. The message was clear. This machine was meant to signal strength and progress. Over several years, it ran more than 450,000 miles on mainline duties without major failure. Power was proven and early reliability looked acceptable. On paper, the future looked bright, but test miles can't show everything. They don't reveal long-term strain or daily wear or how optimism holds up once real service begins. That lesson was still waiting just down the track. As testing continued, the future of the Deltic didn't depend on the engine alone. It depended on people, and more specifically on how British Rail was organized at the time. British railway system was split into regions, and each region acted almost like its own kingdom. Each had its own engineers, its own priorities, and full control over what locomotives it wanted to buy. This meant the Deltic would not be judged once, but many times by very different minds. The London Midland region made its decision quickly. Its chief mechanical engineer rejected the Deltic outright. His objection focused on one number above all else, 1,500 RPM. To him, an engine spinning that fast had no place on the railway. Traditional diesel locomotives ran at much lower speeds, often half that. Higher speeds were associated with wear, noise, and short engine life. From his point of view, the Deltic broke a rule that had guided railway design for decades. The answer was no, and the discussion ended there. The Eastern region saw the same engine and reached the opposite conclusion. Gerard Fines, the region's general manager, cared less about tradition and more about results. The East Coast main line had a serious problem. The famous Gresley Pacific steam locomotives were gone, and the diesels that replaced them couldn't keep up. Journey times increased, schedules slipped, and passengers noticed immediately. Complaints piled up. The Deltic prototype showed it could restore lost performance and bring diesel services closer to steam-era timings. For Fines, that mattered more than theory. He pushed hard for approval and eventually won. 22 locomotives were ordered, enough to replace 55 steam engines. Yet everyone involved knew there was a serious issue waiting in the background. The engines were extremely loud. This wasn't a surprise discovered later. English Electric knew it from the start. These were naval combat engines designed to run fast in open air. Rail locomotives enclosed their engines and crews inside steel bodies. From the first production units, soundproofing was built into the design because the problem was expected. Once the locomotives entered service, British Rail measured noise levels and found them unacceptable even with insulation in place. More changes were made immediately. Details were poorly recorded, and the final figures showed cab noise between 83 and 102 decibels, with everything sealed shut. What the numbers had been before remains unknown. Some answers may exist only in old books and forgotten files, locked away long after the decisions were made. By this point, the reality was impossible to soften. The Deltics entered service at noise levels where hearing protection is medically required. This wasn't a surprise discovery. It was known in advance, accepted by management, and handled through workarounds rather than real fixes. The engines stayed loud, and crews paid the price every day they went to work. Official measurements only tell part of the story. Modern safety rules require hearing protection when noise rises above 85 decibels over an 8-hour shift. The London to Edinburgh run took close to 6 hours. During long, high-power stretches, cab noise often stayed above that limit. At full effort, some readings reached as high as 102 decibels. That level's not just uncomfortable, it's damaging when exposure is repeated day after day. Crews didn't need charts to understand the risk. They learned it through experience. From the first day of service, the engine room was treated as a danger zone. Earplugs became standard equipment in every cab. Anyone entering the space used hearing protection without question. It didn't matter how long the task took. Protection was expected every single time. This mattered because crews had to enter the engine room regularly during each journey. The steam heating boiler was located there, and it needed constant attention. Adjustments were made while the train was running, which meant repeated exposure to extreme noise throughout every shift. In the early 1970s, electric train heating reduced the need for boiler work. That helped slightly, but the core problem never changed. The engines were still just as loud. Years later, the truth became even clearer. A cab ride on a preserved Deltic in 2019 confirmed what former crews had always said. The noise was still intense. More importantly, it was tiring. Not in seconds, but over time. 6 hours inside the cab wore people down. Focus slipped. Communication required raised voices. Fatigue built steadily, even with all sound insulation in place. That was the daily reality for crews, but the noise didn't stop them. Anyone standing on the platform felt it too. Stations like King's Cross, York, Newcastle Central, and Edinburgh Waverley were built for steam. Their vast roofs carried deep echoes, not sharp mechanical buzz. When a Deltic arrived, the sound filled the space, bounced off iron and stone, and made one thing clear. This wasn't a small problem anymore. It was about to become everyone's problem. The effect at stations was impossible to ignore. When a Deltic sat idling at the platform, the noise flooded the entire space. Public address systems became useless. Staff leaned in and shouted just to pass basic information. Passengers missed announcements, missed instructions, and often had no idea what was happening. Even after a train departed, the sound lingered, bouncing off iron roofs and stone walls long after the locomotive was gone. Over time, station staff adapted in their own way. Announcements were delayed until engines shut down, not because rules demanded it, but because working around the noise was the only way to function. Performance explained why British Rail tolerated this, but it was only part of the story. The real cost was still building, and it had nothing to do with speed. Noise was one problem that never went away. Maintenance became another, and it proved far more expensive in the long run. These engines could not be treated like normal locomotives. The truth surfaced quickly. The Deltic was often described as highly strung. This wasn't an insult, it was an honest assessment. The engine demanded perfect handling at all times. Overhauls couldn't be done casually. Everyday railway workshops were not equipped for it. Regular maintenance crews lacked the training needed to work on such a complex machine. The skills required took years to learn. From the start, British Rail kept a large pool of spare engines at Doncaster. The plan was simple. If an engine failed, it was removed at once and replaced with a spare. The faulty unit was then sent away for a full rebuild. This kept trains running on schedule, but it also created total dependence on specialists. Inglis Electric had that expertise, built through long experience with naval engines. As long as they handled the work, the system held together. In 1970, British Rail made a decision that changed everything. They chose to bring engine overhauls in-house. The reason was money. Outsourcing was costly and the bills kept rising. On paper, the choice made sense. British Rail had large workshops, they had skilled workers. They already maintained diesel fleets across the network. The problems began almost immediately. Within a year, roughly half the Deltic fleet was out of service. Cracked cylinder liners became common. Doncaster was well suited for standard diesel work. The Deltic was nothing like a standard diesel. It demanded naval-level precision. Tolerances were tighter, procedures were different, diagnosis required experience no railway shop had yet mastered. British Rail had taken on an engine that refused to forgive mistakes, and the consequences arrived fast. By the early 1970s, it became clear that taking control of maintenance was only the beginning of the struggle. Specialized tools had to be bought in a hurry. New methods had to be learned with no guide to follow. Training programs had to be built from scratch. Inglis Electric had gained its knowledge slowly through years of naval work. British Rail had none of that foundation. They were starting at zero. Mastery didn't come quickly, it took years. During that time, locomotives sat idle waiting for engines that could not yet be repaired correctly. The fleet meant to replace 55 steam engines couldn't deliver full availability when it mattered most. Even once maintenance skills improved, the problems didn't stop. They simply changed form. Exhaust fires became a familiar sight. These were not rare events. They happened often throughout the locomotive's working lives. Oil naturally built up in the exhaust system during normal running. Under long periods of high power, that oil could ignite without warning. Flames burst from the exhaust outlets in full view of crews and bystanders. Drivers learned to expect it. It was not treated as a major emergency, but it demanded constant attention. It was another issue added to an already crowded workload. The running gear brought more trouble. The original bogies began to crack under sustained high-speed use. These locomotives regularly ran at 100 miles per hour on the East Coast main line. The bogies were never designed for that mix of speed, weight, and long-distance running. Cracks appeared again and again. Stronger cast bogies were eventually fitted. This fixed the immediate danger, but it also confirmed an uncomfortable truth. The locomotives were being worked harder than their original design allowed. By the mid-1970s, the bodywork itself started to show serious wear. Structural cracks appeared where none should have existed. Rust developed in areas meant to stay sealed. Questions began to surface about long-term value. Repairs kept them running, but each fix felt more like delay than solution. The maintenance burden grew heavier every year. Each engine needed rare skills. Parts couldn't be shared with other locomotive types. The engineers who truly understood these machines were getting older. New staff trained on modern systems with very different designs. The deep knowledge that kept the Deltics alive was fading quietly, and once that knowledge began to disappear, the fate of the class was already sealed. By the mid-1970s, pressure was coming from every direction at once. Money mattered more than ever. Fuel costs were rising fast, and efficiency was no longer a side concern. It was central to every decision. The Deltics burned fuel at rates that newer designs had already beaten. Cost per mile kept climbing while the remaining life of the locomotives kept shrinking. Every year they stayed in service became harder to justify on paper. None of this meant the design had failed in a simple way. The engine did exactly what it was built to do. The locomotives delivered huge power and sustained high speed, but the full package no longer fit the world it was operating in. What looked bold and advanced in 1961 felt outdated by 1981. When withdrawal finally came, it shocked no one who'd watched the problem stack up year after year. And yet, British Rail kept them running for nearly 2 decades. With all the noise, cost, and maintenance trouble, the question is obvious. Why keep going at all? The answer wasn't complicated. The Deltics filled a gap no other machine could close at the time. Steam was gone. The East Coast main line still demanded speed and power that early diesel designs couldn't provide. Timetables slipped. Passenger complaints grew. The Deltics solved that problem when nothing else could. Carried the railway through a difficult transition period. The gap was only truly closed when the high-speed train entered service in 1978. The drawbacks never disappeared. Cab noise stayed well above safe limits without protection from the first day to the last. This was known before production even started. Soundproofing helped but never solved it. Earplugs remained standard equipment for the entire service life. Maintenance remained just as demanding. The engines never suited normal railway workshop routines. The attempt to bring overhauls in-house proved how hard that gap was to bridge. Years of training were needed. Even then, the spare engine pool at Doncaster was always essential. Without it, availability would have collapsed. Still, the Deltics weren't failures. They did the job they were asked to do. They hauled trains on time, they matched steam where other diesels couldn't, but there were compromises from day one. Necessary compromises. Effective compromises. Ones everyone accepted because there was no better option. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Nothing else worked well enough. But progress never stands still, and eventually something better arrived. By the time the high-speed train arrived, the argument was effectively over. This new train changed what British railways could realistically expect from diesel power. It used conventional engines running at conventional speeds. Maintenance no longer required rare skills learned over years of trial and error. Standard workshop crews could handle the work without fear of crippling mistakes. Performance didn't just match the Deltic, it exceeded it clearly and consistently, and it achieved all of this without turning ear protection into daily survival gear. So, when the last Deltic left service, no serious proposal followed to build a replacement. The design was not refined or modernized for future use. This wasn't because the locomotives had suddenly failed, it's because the world had moved on. In 1961, building them made sense because there were no better choices. In 1982, retiring them made just as much sense for the same reason. Most Deltics met the usual end after withdrawal and were cut up quietly. 6 did not. Those survivors now sit at the center of this story in a very different way. Preserved by enthusiasts, these locomotives still run today on heritage railways. Visitors can ride in the cab and experience what crews once lived with every day. The noise is still intense, the mechanical complexity still obvious, the sharp buzzing exhaust note still cuts through the air, but the setting has changed, and that change matters more than anything else. These engines now run for hours rather than full shifts. They operate on special days instead of demanding daily schedules. Every movement is planned, every risk is managed carefully. What once drained people now excites them. What once caused fatigue now creates awe. What was once a hard compromise has become living history. The preserved Deltics don't prove the design was perfect. They prove what was accepted when no better option existed. They show the cost British Rail knowingly paid to keep trains moving. They show what happens when an engine built for one extreme job is forced into another that demands endurance rather than bursts of power. The Deltic was perfect for fast naval craft where missions were short and noise didn't matter. It was never ideal for daily passenger work. British Rail understood that before the first one ever ran. They went ahead anyway because the need was urgent and the alternatives were worse. The truth is captured by one simple detail. Earplugs were never an emergency item. They were standard equipment from day one to the very end. Power was delivered, performance was achieved, but the cost was accepted rather than solved. Engineering rarely offers protection. It offers trade-offs shaped by need and timing. The Deltic proves that power always comes with a price, and the real story is how people live with that choice. If stories where ambition meets reality are your thing, subscribe for more from the rails.